I'm sure you all know what it means when the rabbi takes his watch off. Nothing. But I'll try to speak for a while and then leave enough time for questions. The landscape with respect to a two-state outcome, and you notice I use the term two-state outcome. Many people use the term two-state solution. Actually, I didn't originate it. Dennis Ross uses the term two-state outcome because he and I'm not sure there is a solution. So, but it's really an ever-changing landscape. I did this presentation 3 weeks ago, and since then, the situation, and all of these things have an impact on the two-state solution. The situation in the north has become more tenuous, as we've all read. The situation in Gaza is becoming even more problematic, as we've all read. There is an annexation bill that is floating around in Israel, meaning to annex major parts of the West Bank. President Rivlin has actually endorsed it, provided that the Palestinians have equal rights. That's a big proviso. And the Prime Minister at one point pulled that legislation. I don't know whether it's back on the table or not. There has recently been a rare public disagreement between the President and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister claimed that he had discussed this annexation proposal with the White House, and that was flatly denied by the White House, which is somewhat unusual in terms of the very close relationship that has been forged between the President and the Prime Minister. The President recently tweeted that he doesn't believe that the Palestinians are serious about negotiating and is not sure about the Israelis. Our President just tweeted this. Now, we all know that the President tweets and then tweets something else, but that's, and the President has also said, and it's not the first time, that Israel has to be really careful about the settlements and that both sides have to make compromises. And finally, as we've all read, the Prime Minister's legal troubles have become more serious. And all of these events have an impact on the possibility and the viability of a two-state outcome, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But one factor, in my judgment, has not changed. And it hasn't changed for years. And that is that the only way to preserve Israel as a Jewish and a democratic state is for there to be, one of these days, a two-state outcome. Two states for two peoples living side by side. And I base that on what I call the analyses of the professional demographers. The professional demographers are professors. The main professor who's been studying this for years and years is Sergio Della Pergola, who is at the Hebrew University. And as well, Amnon Sofer, who's at the University of Haifa. And the latest studies that they've conducted and analyses say that as of 2013, 52% of the people between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River are Jews. But by 2024, it drops to 47.7%. And by 2034, it's down to 46.4%. So that analysis would suggest that certainly almost today and certainly in a few years there will be more Palestinians living in the area from the Jordan River to the sea than there are Jews. Now, the political demographers disagree with that. And the political demographers say, one, well, there's going to be future aliyah, and that's going to impact this balance. And secondly, they say the demographers have miscounted. And thirdly, they say the birth rates in the Palestinian world and the Jewish world have come together. The first argument, yes, there are problems in Europe, and there undoubtedly will be an increase in aliyah from Europe. But I don't see the numbers that we had from the former Soviet Union making a huge impact on the demography. Putting aside the question of are they Jewish or are they not Jewish, that's a whole other issue and a whole other lecture. Not to go into the details, but the professional demographers have counted correctly. And the third is an interesting argument, which is that the birth rates have leveled, which is true. Today, the birth rates in the Palestinian population and the Jewish population are basically the same. However, 10 years ago they were not, 20 years ago they surely were not, and 30 years ago they surely were not. So what does that mean? That today there are many more 10-year-old Palestinians than there are Jews. There are many more 20-year-old Palestinians than there are Jews, and there are many more 30-year-old Palestinians than there are Jews. So as they have kids, the outcome is obvious, that it will exacerbate, not reduce, the disparity between Jews and Arabs living between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea and the Jordan River. But even if the political demographers are correct, my question is are Israelis comfortable with basically a 50-50, which is what it's going to be at best? And I think the answer to that is no, because then it gets back to the question of is it a Jewish state? Is it a democratic state? And it can't be both. So that's a long explanation for why I believe that there's no alternative but a two-state outcome. And the question is, how do you get there? Because for starters, and I'll come back to this at the end, there's no prospect that there can be a two-state outcome anytime soon, for reasons that we all know, but I'll talk about. So briefly, the issues are the same issues that we've been dealing with for 20 years. Security, borders, the right of return, Jerusalem, and the Temple Mount. None of that has changed. So let's just spend a second talking about each and then go on to what the prospect is. Jerusalem has been the most publicized in the last month, ever since the president recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And he now says it's off the table. Not sure I know what that means, and I'm not sure I agree with that. I have no problem whatever with the president's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It's just reality. Knesset's there, Supreme Court's there. It is the capital of Israel. But he said two other things at the same time. He said the borders have to be negotiated. And he said, finally, that he's okay with a two-state solution. He hinted to that many, many months ago, where he said, one state, two states, I don't really care, whatever the parties want. Well, a lot of people were not happy with that discussion. I didn't find it problematic, because whatever the parties want means that there has to be an agreement between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And as of now, although that's changing, the Palestinians want a two-state outcome. So he recognizes Jerusalem. He says the borders have to be negotiated. But that did not prevent Mahmoud Abbas from basically going ballistic. He denounced the recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He urged reconciliation with Hamas, which is a total non-starter in terms of the eventual possibility of a two-state outcome. He refused to meet with Vice President Pence. He has said since then that he will not accept the U.S. as a mediator, and the worst was he called Zionism a colonial enterprise which has nothing to do with Jewishness, and he said the people in Europe sent their Jews to Israel. It's more than amazing. However, he said all those things. But what did he not do or say? He did not embrace the concept of a one-state solution. He did not, and listen, Abu Mazen is no hero of mine, believe me. But he did not urge provocative acts. He did not urge violence. He did not discontinue the cooperation with the Israeli security services. Now, one of the reasons why he doesn't do that is because he values his own personal safety. And he realizes that the cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and the IDF and the security services is critical, not only to the stability of the West Bank, but to his own personal security. So that's Jerusalem. Security. Security is to me, the key issue in this whole, of the whole five. And I'll talk a little bit more later about the Commanders for Israel Security, which is an organization formed about 2 years ago, now consisting of 280 retired IDF generals and their counterparts in the security services and the National Police. And I'm told it's 80% of that group. And they have endorsed a two-state outcome for reasons that I will explain later. And then there's an organization called the Center for a New American Security. One of the interesting things about this proposal is one of the authors. One of the authors is Colonel Chris Bauman. Okay, Colonel Chris Bauman, right now, as we speak, he's an active duty Air Force officer, and he is an assistant on the National Security Council in the White House in charge of the Middle East. So he's right there. And he was one of the authors of this security system for the two-state solution. I mean, basically, the key principles are, and this is all in this brochure, so I won't spend a lot of time, build a multi-layered system where Israel retains the right of self-defense, as well as the capacity to defend itself, for mutually reinforcing security measures, internal security, border security, non-ground security, regional security, and steps that can and should be taken right now to implement that. There are very serious proposals which will never guarantee, because there aren't any guarantees, but that have suggested significant actions that can be taken to ensure Israel's security as best it can ever be ensured. Borders, everybody recognizes that the borders are going to be the 67 borders with swaps, and Israel will retain the settlement blocks. There will be swaps of land to make up for the annexation of those in connection with an agreement. But there are still issues. One issue, for example, is what do you do with Ariel? Okay, Ariel is a city. It's about 12 miles east of Tel Aviv. It's got a university. There are 20,000 people and 10,000 students. What's the problem with Ariel? Well, Ariel, if the green line is here, Ariel is a finger into the West Bank. And the Palestinians say, if Ariel stays in Israel, it will cut off the contiguity between the Arab villages that live north of the finger and those that live south of the finger. To me, there are ways to solve that problem. They're called bridges and tunnels. And so you can have this finger going into the West Bank, and you can have bridges over, tunnels under, so that the Palestinian villages here and here will still be contiguous. But if Ariel stays in Israel, then there isn't enough Israeli land to swap for Ariel. That's a problem. There's a solution to that problem. Other compensation that can be given to the Palestinians beside land, more economic aid, you name it. There are many, many ways to do that. The right of return, another issue that has been talked about forever, and obviously there cannot be more than a token right of return if there's going to be a two-state outcome for Palestinians moving into the state of Israel, because if there is more than that, then it's not a Jewish state. And there have been recent indications that the Palestinians recognize that and, again, are going to be prepared to take other compensation. And finally, the Temple Mount, and that is obviously a concern, but the probability is that the Temple Mount will be administered by some international body, and the sanctity of the holy places will be assured. Okay, so that's the background, and so the question is, what now? And as I said at the outset, there's just no prospect that at any time in the foreseeable future there can be an agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians to establish a two-state outcome. Not necessarily because the people in Israel and the people in the Palestinian territory, the West Bank, and I'm putting Gaza aside for a moment. Gaza is a totally different and more problematic area. But a very recent poll conducted jointly by the Palestinian Center for Policy and Survey Research, which is headed by a man by the name of Khalil Shikaki, who is a very highly respected poller, and by Dalia Scheindlin of the Tammy Steinmetz Center for Peace Research at Tel Aviv University. That's just 2 months ago, less. What that poll showed is that 46% of Israelis and 46% of Palestinians still favor a two-state outcome, and that they prefer a two-state outcome when compared to the other alternatives, and the other main alternative is the one-state outcome. More significant, 44% of the Jews who opposed the two-state outcome would change their minds if the Palestinian Authority would commit itself to ongoing security cooperation, which exists right now. Now, having said that, there's a big issue about the Palestinian Authority paying the families of terrorists who killed Israelis. There's just no question about it. That is a huge issue. It's just got to stop. But ongoing security cooperation, which means intelligence sharing, preventing attacks, arresting terror suspects, if those are in the mix, the percentage of Israelis favoring a two-state outcome goes up to 59%. And on the other hand, 39% of the Palestinians who were opposed to a two-state outcome would change their minds if, and some of this is problematic, I agree, if Israel recognized the Nakba, which is, you know, the Palestinian problem with what happened in 48, recognized the suffering of the refugees, okay, and provided compensation, and that's very significant, provided compensation to the refugees. That's not saying the refugees have to go back to Israel. That's saying compensation. And there are problems with all of that, but if those are in the package, the percentage of the Palestinians favoring a two-state solution gets to 62%. Having said all that, there's a problem. And the problem is that when you get to the younger generation of Palestinians, they are much more in favor of one state than their older brethren. And that's because, among other reasons, that they now are starting to focus on civil rights, and they don't care if it's one state or two states. They want civil rights, and if it can't be in a two-state outcome, they'll take it in a one-state outcome. Now, to me, that's a little short-sighted. I mean, you need only look at the history of minority groups, although they will soon not be a minority group if there's a one-state solution. But in countries where there are civil rights, look at Israel itself. There are civil rights to Israeli Arabs. It's in the Declaration of Independence. But as a practical matter, although this is changing somewhat, and I give the Netanyahu government credit that it has devoted more resources to bring up the level of education and infrastructure in the Israeli Arab communities than any of its predecessors. But the fact of the matter still is that Israeli Arabs are just not equal in terms of equal rights to Jews. And I mean, look at this country and look at our long history of discrimination against minority groups, whether they be African Americans or Hispanics, or and so the idea that this younger generation of Palestinians will get their civil rights in a one-state solution, to me, is a little optimistic. And then you have the regional situation, which would point toward the fact that this is a perfect time to negotiate a two-state outcome, because Israel has now allied itself, because of the regional situation, with Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, and so if there's a regional construct of the outcome between the Palestinians and the Israelis, and the moderate Arab states, let's call them the moderate Arab states, so-called, adopt the proposals, there could well be a two-state outcome sooner rather than later. And the continuing conflict between Israel and those states and Iran will only solidify more the alliance of interest between those Arab states and Israel. This is all the prospects that might be, you know, the good news, and that the people want it, the region wants it. The problem is the leadership of Israel and the Palestinian Authority is not prepared to move there. You know, the Prime Minister says he still wants a two-state solution, but he's a prisoner of his own coalition, and his own legal situation makes him even more reluctant to tinker with that. So on the Israeli side, there's not going to be a huge push toward a two-state outcome. Then the question is, well, what's the United States going to do? And if anybody knows the answer to that question, tell me, because I'm not sure anybody knows. What I think we do know, however, is the President of the United States wants to do this deal. Okay, he wants to be the President of the United States that does what all of his predecessors before him couldn't do. And he can't do that by continuing to support all of the Israeli positions. So I'm waiting for the proverbial other shoe to drop. And meaning, will the President at one point say to the Prime Minister, I gave you Jerusalem as your capital. You need to give me, it could be capital of the Palestinian state will be in East Jerusalem. To me, it's not the end of the world. There are parts of East Jerusalem that Israelis never go to. East Jerusalem today contains 28 Arab villages that were annexed by Israel in '67, which never were part of Israel before. The Shukat refugee camp is a place that Jews never go to. So if that's what he wants, it's going to be really hard. Or does he want a freeze on building outside of the blocks? Or does he want the Israelis to accept in principle the Arab Peace Initiative, which has been out there for more than 10 years, proposed by the Saudis, rejected by the Israelis for good and sufficient reason, but it could form the framework of a way forward. In a call that I was part of with Shikaki 2 months ago, or even less, after the president recognized Jerusalem, he said that it was critical in terms of the Palestinians, and in order to bring them back into the fold, that the president recognize East Jerusalem as the capital. I asked him on the phone, well, what about if the president wasn't prepared to do that, but he's demanding of the prime minister that he embrace the Arab Peace Initiative? And he said, not as good, but worth thinking about. But this is all talk, and this is all speculation. So what now if the assumption is that there is not going to be a two-state outcome at any time soon? And that brings me to Security First, which is a publication of the Commanders for Israel Security, which I talked briefly about before. I became familiar with CIS when I broke a promise that I made to myself and my wife that I was never going to get involved in another Jewish organization. I've been there, I've done that, but I have followed the Israel Policy Forum for many, many years. The Israel Policy Forum was founded in the 90s at the behest of then Prime Minister Rabin to advocate for a two-state solution. My problem with the Israel Policy Forum, as it has been with most of the two-state solution advocates, is they just weren't serious enough about security. The then president of the Israel Policy Forum asked me 2.5 years ago, come to lunch, and I did. And he told me about Commanders for Israel Security. And as I said, 280 retired IDF generals and their counterparts in the security services and the national police. The usual rap on retired IDF generals is they're all lefties, and so forget about them. Well, if 80% of that complement is signing on, they can't all be lefties. The man who formed CIS is a man named Amnon Reshef. Amnon Reshef commanded the tank corps in the '73 war in the Sinai. He is a genuine Israeli hero. I mean, you all know, or most of you know, what happened in the Sinai in '73, and that was Amnon Reshef and his troops. And about 5 years ago, he says, he was having a very, very great retirement life. He was playing with his grandchildren, and we all know how terrific that is. And one day he said to himself, but what kind of state is there going to be for my grandchildren years down the road? And he decided that he would write a letter to the prime minister and suggest that there are actions that the Israeli government should take in order that there be a two-state outcome down the road, because he did not believe that there was any other possibility for Israel to remain a Jewish and democratic state. He circulated this letter to some of his colleagues, and before he knew it, there were 25 co-signers. They sent the letter. They continued to attract others, and now there are the 280. But briefly, what the commanders propose are security measures, political measures, and economic measures that Israel can do right now. And they're not proposing these measures because they love the Palestinians. They're proposing these measures in order to maintain the possibility that down the road there can be a two-state outcome. So, briefly, the security measures: complete the construction of the security fence, implement strict border control regime. This is continued IDF military control over the West Bank until a permanent status agreement is reached. Political measures: accept in principle the Arab Peace Initiative, reiterate the commitment to resolve the conflict through negotiations. One that, as a lawyer who's negotiated many, many settlements, I'm not sure I would put out on the table right now, is recognize, forego any claims of sovereignty outside of the settlement blocks. That could happen down the road, but just as a negotiating position, I'm not sure I would do that. And freezing construction of settlements outside the blocks. And economic measures designed to improve the welfare of the Palestinians in Jerusalem, establishing an umbrella municipal authority, and so forth. The Arab Peace Initiative said, if you agree to go back to the 67 borders, we, the Arab, will recognize Israel, and we will establish diplomatic relationships and trade relations. And the problem, obviously, with that is there's no way the Israelis are going to agree to go back to the 67 borders. They're not going to give up the Gush. They're not going to give up Ma'ale Adumim. They're not going to give up. So that's what stopped the Arab Peace Initiative. But that doesn't mean that it can't be the basis for future negotiations. So that's it. Now, the commanders have met with the Prime Minister 3 times. The first time, according to what Amnon has told us, he was very interested and very enthusiastic, and he said he wanted to study it. I mean, they gave him this. And they had a second meeting a couple of months later. He didn't want to talk about it. And then there was a third meeting, and the problem is that he is not in a position right now to agree to freeze construction outside the blocks. He's certainly not in a position to forego sovereignty over the Green Line, except for the blocks. That's where we are, which maybe is not any further than we've been before. But what the commanders did a year or so ago, after they had not had a great reception from the Prime Minister, is they launched a public advertising campaign with billboards all over the country. And the thrust of the billboards was, do you want to be in a non-Jewish or non-democratic state? And they are basically going to the public. It hasn't succeeded. They're going to continue to try. And so I'll end where I started. which is that the only way, in my view, to maintain Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is for there to be, at some point down the road, a two-state outcome. And the only constructive suggestions in that regard come from the commanders. So I have 15 minutes left, and I'm happy to answer any questions. The question is, forget the Palestinians, what do I see as the prospects on the Israeli side? I'm not optimistic, for all the reasons I've indicated. His coalition is, yeah, he's got a 6-vote cushion. It's not a lot of votes. He's now facing significant legal challenges. He's not going to be anxious to take a bold initiative. So, and even the initiatives that are proposed by the commanders is probably too bold for the prime minister. So I don't expect that there to be any movement. And listen, he is faced with significant security challenges. What's happening in Syria is very, very serious. And he is not likely, in my judgment, to divert his attention from that to this. There will be a next prime minister at some point. But this prime minister has said, I'm not resigning. He doesn't have to resign until he's convicted. The next elections are not scheduled till late 2019. So between now and 2019, Mr. Netanyahu is going to be the prime minister. What's going to happen after that? I have no idea. So the question is, on the Palestinian side, who are they negotiating with? You know, the Hamas reconciliation is significantly problematic as Hamas continues to call for the destruction of the state of Israel and killing Jews. It's a big problem. I don't know. You know, and again, that's what leads me to the conclusion that as long as Abu Mazen is the head of the Palestinian Authority, you know, he's 82 years old. He's going into the 14th year of his 4-year term. But he's still there. And there's no real logical successor on the horizon. The one successor that people think could be a positive force is a guy named Marwan Barghouti, who's serving 5 consecutive life terms in an Israeli jail for killing Jews. So are the Israelis going to say, okay, Marwan, you know, we're going to release you, go. I don't see it. The question is there pressure coming from outside? And the only pressure that I can see coming from the outside is this regional cooperation scenario, because, as I've said, the interests of Israel and Egypt and Jordan and the Emirates and Saudi are all the same. Their enemy is making them all friends. But I don't see it. Yes, ma'am. So the question is whether the younger Palestinians are not as enthusiastic about a two-state outcome because they would rather be in one state which is more Western and more progressive. I think that's part of it. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is total and complete frustration with the prospects that there can be a two-state outcome, which I can understand. For all the reasons I've said, a 30-year-old Palestinian has to say, this might happen in my lifetime, but it's not going to be anytime soon, so why don't we shift gears and advocate for a two-state outcome? Yeah, so the question isn't another reason that they prefer a one-state outcome is because the demographics are in their favor. And I think the answer to that is yes, but as I understand it, they're not really focused on that. They're really focused on civil rights, and the quickest way to get civil rights is for there to be a one-state solution. Yes, the question is, has there been any decision made as to what the Palestinian government would look like in a Palestinian state? And I think the answer to that is no, because we're not anywhere near that. And so, and the other part of your question, which I think is a good one, is if you have free elections, who's going to win those elections? And during the administration of George W. Bush, he wanted free elections because he was in favor of democracy. His advisors and the Israelis, including Condoleezza Rice, his secretary, don't do this because it's not going to come out well, and it didn't. So I think that is a significant problem. Yes, sir. Yeah, so the question is, should there be somewhat of a different approach to the Gaza situation in order to try to alleviate the humanitarian crisis? And the answer is yes, but nobody has come up with the way to do it. One proposal that has been made, which seems to me to be potentially advantageous, is build some kind of an island seaport in the Mediterranean, and which is controlled by the Israelis, but would allow the importation of all of what's necessary. Build a desalinization plant in the Mediterranean as there are off Israel. While the President's Conference did a trip about 3 years ago to Turkey and Egypt, and then I don't know whether it was the Prime Minister or the President, Mr. Erdogan, proposed that Turkey will actually build a power plant in Gaza, and it will build this and it will build that, and that would be great, but it's not happened. And the problem remains. And by the way, you ask if the Gaza situation is good for Israel. I think it's not good at all, because I really worry about an uprising in Gaza, because there's no food and there's no water, and it's just an impossible situation. However, the problem has always been that unless you control what goes into Gaza, all you're doing is giving Hamas more steel and more this and more that. So that's a much more difficult problem than the one I've been talking about. Listen, the question is, I said that Abbas has not called for violence, and I don't remember this, but it doesn't surprise me that in advance of the recognition, he called for 3 days of rage. But he's never really followed through. As I said before, he's not a hero of mine, but he has, in his own way, kept the lid on the situation in the West Bank through the cooperation between the Palestinian Authority, security services, and the Israelis. The question is whether the CIS Security First proposals discuss what will be the outcome if Hamas takes over in the West Bank. And the answer to that is no, because the thrust of these proposals are what Israel can do now in the political, economic, and security. And so they have not, in this document, gotten into those possibilities. Okay, last question. The question is, what do I see as the role of the United States government in bringing all this about, particularly because as the questioner says, the person who is supposedly in control of this is Jared Kushner. You know, another person who is very significantly involved in this effort is Jason Greenblatt. Okay, and he made a trip to the Middle East and to Israel mainly soon after the president was elected, and he got rave reviews. He spoke to everybody, he listened, he talked, and you know, whoever orchestrated that trip did a very good job. I think the role could be what I suggested before, that the president says to the prime minister, this is what I need you to do. Now, is the prime minister's current legal situation possibly going to be a deterrent for the president to do that? Could be. I mean, but, you know, again, I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of possibilities as and I guess I'll end with the statement that this president wants to do this deal. He wants to be the president who brought about an outcome. We'll see. Thank you for coming and for your attention.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.